Hello, in this video we'll see how voxels can interact with dungeons. In the previous versions of YAG, the dungeons and the voxel were two completely independent features. During its construction, the voxel terrain didn't see the dungeon and had to be manually edited and sculpted to accommodate the presence of the dungeon. You can see how it worked until now. The terrain simply builds as if the dungeon wasn't there. It can have its charms for some ruins, but most of the time it's not what we want. So it's now possible for the terrain to see the dungeon and actually build around it. It's done using this option here in the dungeon interaction panel from the voxel window. I unchecked it for the introduction of this video because I needed the voxels to be dungeon blind, but it is checked by default. So let's check it back and rebuild. And what we're going to see now is, from now on, the default behavior of YAG. As you can see, the terrain is now built around the dungeon. Voxels are removed above the dungeon to create holes, and they are added under the dungeon to create cliffs. This compensation also takes into account the location of the voxel cube. So, for example, if we move it up like 30 meters and rebuild, you can see that it will create deeper holes which make some cool dungeon tunnels. And if on the contrary we move it down and rebuild, okay, then we'll get some high cliffs all around the dungeon. Okay, so let's come back to 0 here and back to the dungeon interaction panel, where we have a few other options to explore. The first one here is the width of the horizontal margin around the dungeon, which will create a platform. So let's put it, for example, to 5 meters and build. And you can see that now we have that margin, that platform, all around the dungeon. And it works both ways, on cliffs, as you can see here, as well as in holes, as you can see here. So the next option here, this one, has no artistic purpose. It is only here to work around a little unavoidable problem. As you know, the voxels have a 1 meter precision, which we'll better see if I go into cubic rendering. Okay, so here we see what's really going on mathematically, and you can see that we can only have certain heights because we have a 1 meter precision on the voxels. On the other hand, the dungeon ground can be any height, any altitude. So sometimes it can happen that the ground of the terrain will be above the ground of the dungeon. So this option here is is there to offset the voxel ground to fix this problem. So just to show you, let's fake the problem by raising the ground, okay, 1 meter. And you can see that now the ground of the voxel is covering that of the dungeon. So if you see that sort of thing while there is no offset here, just put it to -1 and it will fix the problem. You'll get your dungeon ground back. Okay? Right, so let's come back to a more beautiful view and suppress this offset here. Okay. The next option, this one, gives the height of the ceiling above the dungeon. It is expressed in meters or in feet if it's your chosen unit, and defaults to 50 kilometers. This means that by default the dungeon will always be entirely visible because there will be 50 kilometers of empty space above its ground. And if I elevate the voxel by 30 meters, the terrains by 30 meters, and rebuild it, the dungeon always remains visible, okay, whatever the height, as you can see here, right? But this is not always desired, and we can choose the height of the ceiling. For example, if I let only 15 meters above its ground, so a ceiling of 15 meters high, and rebuild, I get a high ceiling, okay, below the mountain. And here, just to show you a cool trick, let's not forget that the light that we have here is entirely artificial. So I can turn it off. It's done here, 0. And you can see that while we are in broad daylight and we can see nothing unusual on the mountain, when we go into the dungeon, when we find the entrance of the dungeon and go inside it, it is pitch black, which can be very immersive for players, and which explains you why I gave this knight a torch. Okay, so back to normal lighting. Okay, the next option, the UI is here. The The next option is a very easy one. It's simply this one here. So this one we already saw that it basically enables or disables this whole effect. This one here simply sets whether or not to remove the surroundings. So if I check it, I get only the dungeon. Okay, no surrounding, which I can then surround by a margin, for example, a 10 meters margin. Okay. So this can be a different way to use the voxels if you like. Okay, we're going to put back the surroundings. Those three options here tell Yak to paint the foliage on and off on the three parts of the terrain: the dungeon itself, the margin, and the surrounding. Okay. Although they concern foliage, they are in the shape panel and not in the foliage panel here, because they depend on the shape. It is important to understand the difference between this and this. So we're going to spend a few minutes on that one. The foliage panel here sets whether foliage should be used, which kind, and how much. Once it is set, it cannot be changed until you set new settings here. Okay. This one, on the contrary, simply tells Yak to display or not the foliage respectively on the dungeon with this option, the margin with this option, and the surroundings with this option. They do automatically what you would normally have to do by hand through manual edition here. Okay. So we can consider those options as some auto painting, so to speak. Some example will illustrate this better. I can put foliage only on the margin, for example. So let's choose foliage, northern forest here, and I can decide to put foliage only on the margin. Okay. So it takes a bit longer to rebuild because the foliage is always a bit long, but you can see how it go and how it will go all around the dungeon. Okay. So the default is to have it on the margin and the surroundings to only leave the dungeon clean. Okay, the three are completely independent, so you can choose to allow the foliage on one, two, three, or none of them, okay, independently. So let me show you two extreme examples so you understand the difference better. If I set no foliage here, okay, and then allow the foliage everywhere, I will get nothing simply because there is no foliage setup. So those options here are completely useless. They have no effect. If on the contrary, I choose some foliage but remove it, uncheck the three options, I will also get nothing, but there is a big difference there. You can see that there is much more task going on. Now the foliage is configured to be present everywhere, and it can be displayed either automatically, as we saw using those options, but also manually through edition. So basically I can remove all the foliage and then paint it on automatically or manually where I want. So let's try to do this. And you can see that here I'm going to choose the painting tool, choose the foliage option here, and then paint. And I can basically put foliage wherever I want manually, okay, because it's simply there. So I hope you understand the difference between okay, so you see the line that I draw. Okay, I hope it's clear for everyone. So let's remove the manual editing here, stop the edition, and go back to our window. Okay, no foliage will be faster. Why don't I have any? Yes, it's arriving. Okay, so the last option on this panel here is a bit exotic and it probably won't be used too much, but it's there. By unchecking it, YAG will stop compensating the vertical offset of the terrain. This means that the shape and foliage of the terrain can be driven by the dungeon while the dungeon remains hidden. To illustrate this, let's raise the voxel cube and uncheck this option. So the cube is already um, up here. We are just simply going to uncheck the option. And you'll see that we are going to get the shape of the dungeon, but at the level of the terrain of the voxel. Okay, so you can see that now the dungeon is completely invisible, so we won't see it. But it is still driving the shape of the terrain here. So it can be useful, for example, if you want to make an automatic clearing or an oasis. Okay, for example, if I choose a northern forest and go back to the regular options here and apply, you see I'm going to get foliage everywhere, the margin, the surroundings. I'm moving a bit around because the voxel engine is building preferentially where the camera is. So when you move around, you force things to become visible. So as you can see here, we have foliage. It's still not finished. Okay, there are a lot of tasks remaining for the voxel and the foliage, but basically you see the effect here. You can prepare your own clearing and it has the shape of the dungeon. So of course you could have a path made of foliage or just a margin to create, for example, some oasis, or you can have like here just a clearing the shape of the dungeon. And the dungeon, while remaining invisible, is still driving the shape of that clearing, of that path. So you can really make the path the shape you want very easily in a forest. Okay? Right. So this works both for the shape and the foliage. All right, we are almost done. The last option is on the dungeon panel, so I'm going to check this back, remove the foliage. Oops, check it back again. So we can draw our dungeon fast and come back here to 0. All right, so the very last option is not on the voxel panel, it is on the dungeon panel here. It is this this option here. So if you check it, the voxel terrain will automatically be rebuilt after the dungeon, so this spares you the effort when you are rebuilding. So for example, if I uncheck it, okay, and say I build a dungeon, I choose a different shape and rebuild a new dungeon. If I want the voxel to build around, I have to open the voxel window and then check back and then reapply, so I get my new shape here. Okay, but this can be a long process. So instead, there is this option which will automatically update the voxel after the dungeon has been rebuilt. So if I come back to my initial shape, then the voxel are automatically rebuilt. Okay. Uh, This is not always desired because first, voxels rebuilding can take time, especially when there is foliage, and this might be annoying while testing dungeon shapes. And second, it is useless when only changing the dungeon theme. So it is currently unchecked by default, and you have to manually check it when you need it. All right, I think we are finished here. So thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if yes, then see you in the next, hopefully. Thank you. Bye.